Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Knowledge Bank webinar. Today's session is being hosted by Adam Sanders from Riskbase, and he is going to be speaking to you about PEEPS, resident engagement, and fire door checks. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. We will be trying to get through as many as possible throughout the webinar and at the Q&A at the end. The webinar is being recorded today, so it will be available to watch back for anyone that cannot join us live or anyone who would simply just like to watch again. And if anyone would like a copy of the slides, they should be available from myself or Adam after the webinar. That is all from me. I am now going to pass you on to Adam to begin.
Cool. Thanks, Vicky. Okay, so this new legislation around PEEPS, it's not hugely complicated, but I think it's yet another piece of quite a complicated jigsaw. And we've spent the past year, 18 months, trying to put together a process that combines not just the new legislation around PEEPS and the emergency evacuation statements, but trying to combine that into other requirements that need to be completed, flat entrance door checks, and the general fire safety order duties. So I just want to kind of walk through that as to give some context to this. There's three old core bits of legislation that we've got that are, and some of them are quite new. Building Safety Act being the main one, 18-meter blocks only that this applies to. But this brought in a requirement to know all relevant residents, basically anybody over the age of 16 that's a resident within a block. To prepare this resident engagement strategy, which I think most people have done, whether those strategies are effectively implemented is another question. But one of the other things is to make available prescribed information. And the prescribed information that you have to make available to these residents is in another bit of secondary legislation called the Higher Risk Buildings Keeping and Provision of Information England regulations. There's loads of really catchy titles. But effectively, it's a summary of the golden thread that has to be made available to residents. I don't think many people are doing that, but it's there in the legislation. And we've got Fire Safety England regs, which obviously came in 2023, where at least every year, and crucially, when a new resident moves in, so this is saying, wait a second, on flats that are let, we need to know when that resident moves in and out. And I don't think many block managers have got a process to do that, but there's effectively a legal requirement to do it. And when they move in or every year, they need to be given information on what to do if there's a fire, that evacuation strategy, and information on fire doors, including their flat entrance doors and the fact they can't tamper with them and where to open, that kind of stuff. And then there's the fire safety order, which is getting on for 20 years old now, but was updated a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, by the Building Safety Act to say that residents now have the right to see information on outstanding risks identified from the risk assessment and also information on existing preventative and protective measures. And by that, we effectively mean the outline fire strategy for the building. So is there a fire alarm? How does it work? What do the automatic vents do? Smoke vents do? What's the protection to the common parts? That kind of thing. And I think the crucial thing here is that all of this fire safety legislation now has got this element of resident engagement. And as we move further along, there's the trend is provide an electronic system so that this information is consistent, is available to these residents. And it's probably not something that you can update manually. If you're managing more than a few blocks, this has to be available. And crucially, 2 out of the 3 bits of this legislation on the screen apply to all blocks, not just 11 meters and not just 18-meter buildings. I'm not going to bore everybody too much with this golden thread stuff, but because everybody talks about it, but I think it's massively overused. the legal definition of it is in this secondary legislation on the right-hand side, but effectively, it's all of the fire and building safety information for the building, and you have to store it digitally, securely, and the information has to be accurate. So that means if you've got a risk assessment or a survey and that's incorrectly identified something, you need to address it. There needs to be a way where you can go into a system and get the latest set of data for a building. And then crucially, accessible to those who need to use it in a format they can use it and when they need to use it. So that means if the guys on site need to get to it, they need to get to it. Sending them a PDF may or may not be the right way to do that. I'd argue it's not. Crucially, you can't run Golden Thread with a collection of PDFs in OneDrive. And when people talk about a single source of truth, that doesn't mean it has to be a single system. I think one of the important things is that all of the systems that you use have to talk to each other. So if you've got Dwellin and Fixflow and Cube and Riskbase and something else, all of those systems have to talk to each other. Trying to move on. So this concept of PEEPS, they've been around for quite a long time, but they came out of Disability Discrimination Act and then later on what became the Equality Act. And this was about employees, or typically employees, and making sure that they had a plan to evacuate in an emergency. After the Grenfell Tower fire, Hackett, and then the inquiry itself, they made a whole load of recommendations about what should change with fire safety legislation and management. The result was the Building Safety Act. The only recommendation that the inquiry made that wasn't implemented was about PEEPS, was about a requirement for, inverted commas, the building owner to provide a plan for individual residents. Government said it wasn't practical, it was too expensive, who was going to pay for it? And the PAS 79 committee at the BSI, and PAS 79, I'm sure most of you know, that's the standard to which most fire risk assessments are done or were done. They also agreed and said, look, it's not really going to benefit that many people. But media pressure, the PAS 79 working group kind of threw their hands in the air and the standard was withdrawn. And Michael Gove pushed through the 2025 regulations. And they are and another catchy title, Fire Safety Residential Evacuation Plans, England Regulations. It is worth, by the way, I'm going to go through the key regulations within this, but it's worth actually looking at the legislation itself. It's not that complicated. And in some ways it's clearer than the guidance which the government have produced, which seems to be incredibly focused on social housing. Just a quick run through. These are the main acronyms. So we've got RPEEP or PEEP, same thing basically. RPEEP is just a residential PEEP. It's not a document. It's this whole process that we're going to describe. One of the parts of that process, sometimes, and I think in the private sector and leasehold management, it's going to be quite rare, is this production of a PCFRA, a person-centered fire risk assessment. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. The output of that person-centered fire risk assessment is an emergency evacuation statement, or an EES. To make things a little bit more complicated still, the fire service want an even simpler EES, which is this information that you've got to provide to the fire service off the back of it. And there's a lesser known thing called a BEEP, which is a building level emergency evacuation plan, which is pretty much just the strategy for the building, along with some basic information on how many PEEPs there are. And that just sits in the SIB. So going back to this PEEP process, this is roughly it. The core thing, identifying these inverted commas relevant residents, and a relevant resident is anybody who needs support evacuating. But obviously, to be able to identify the people that have got some kind of a disability or vulnerability, you need to know who all the residents are. So actually, there should be a stage before this that says, make sure you know who all your residents are, then identify the ones that have got some kind of a vulnerability, offer them a PCFRA. If they accept it and you do one, and you don't have to do it, you can outsource it, you can use a consultant to do it. If they accept it, great, fine, follow that process. The output of that for you, or the bit that's important for you, is this EES, the emergency evacuation statement. It is, however, perfectly possible to produce that emergency evacuation statement without having to do the PCFRA. So you can literally chat on the phone to somebody and say, what's the problem? Oh, I use a Zimmer frame, blah, blah, blah. Okay, agree with them how they would evacuate. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Sometimes there may be some mitigation measures that are required. I think it's going to be really rare. It is, again, very focused on social housing, where they are more likely to have care providers working within their blocks and to have care and supported living schemes as well. But basically, if the PCFRA requires mitigation measures to be installed in the communal area, that might be like an evacuation chair or something like that, then, and we'll talk about this, if there is consent from a financial perspective, then that's your responsibility to install it. It's the responsible person's responsibility to install it. Once you've got all that, some of the information has to be shared with the local fire and rescue service. We'll talk about what and how and why. And then at least every year, that information needs to be updated. So new PCFRA or review of the PCFRA and this emergency evacuation statement, and an update of the SIB documentation too, or a review of it. I think I've probably covered this, to be honest. Right, so first step, identifying these residents. Whatever systems you're using that are identifying and managing your leaseholders, we've got to add something else to it to say, are they actually resident? And if they're not, who's resident? Now, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And ideally, it's automated. We've got some tools which I'll show you later that will help you identify those flats, those residents in flats that you're not sure who's living there. And we think the easiest way to do this is to combine it with the flat entrance door checks. Okay, so looking at this person-centered fire risk assessment. On the left-hand side of this slide, and we'll talk about who has to pay for this and stuff later. Left-hand side of the slide, the A and B is actually directly from the legislation. The crucial thing is the responsible person has got to offer to carry out the PCFRA. You can outsource that. But the legislation is saying that it's the identification of the risks to that resident, and what assistance they require. BS 9792, which is the standard that replaced PAS 79 after the working group walked out. They didn't quite walk out, but they pretty much did. That is the only real definition of how to carry out a PCFRA. So if you're thinking of doing them in-house, and there really is no reason why you shouldn't. There's no real competency requirements here. The only thing that I would say is it's ideally carried out by somebody that knows that resident. So creating some forms and some guidance for the PCFRAs for your residents or their carers or children or whatever to help them carry out the PCFRA might be a better way to go. BS 9792, however, if you Google it, I think it's £250. It's paywalled by the BSI. However, if you Google BS9, and I didn't say this, obviously, if you Google BS 9792 and IFSM, you will find that they've accidentally put a non-paywalled version of that standard up, and Google will find it for you. So, and this process that I'm showing you now is pretty much taken from that 9792. The first thing, tell us about the resident and their characteristics. And that could be they've got dementia, or they've got severe autism, or they can't walk, they're in a wheelchair, or they're morbidly obese, or something like that, and understanding why that's an issue. Then identifying any additional risks. And most of the time, there probably won't be any specific ones, but if they were a very heavy smoker or only ate food from a deep fryer or had lots of e-bikes on charge, that'd be it. That might be it. Rapid fire development, that's just if there was a fire, is it going to spread through the flat really quickly? And we're pretty much only worried about fire loading, the main thing being hoarding. And whether there is anything already in place to protect the resident. So is there a fire alarm in the flat? Obvious one. So if there was a fire in a different room, they can react to it earlier. And whether there's suppression. So certainly housing associations install misting systems for people with disabilities, or if they've got any adaptations, stair lifts or handrails, that kind of thing. Then the next thing is, how would that resident respond? So if they had really severe autism, or they were deaf or blind, then they might not respond to a fire. Whether they see the fire or whether they see the fire alarm, they might just entirely ignore it. If they did respond, what could they do? If they were in a wheelchair, they could probably leave the flat, but they wouldn't be able to go down the stairs if you didn't have evacuation lifts. And then the next thing is, what can we do? What mitigation measures could be implemented to help that resident evacuate? And again, powered door openers, evac chairs, if they've got a carer. If they haven't, an evac chair is obviously not going to help unless there's a neighbour or somebody else that can assist. And then a bit of a summary saying what's the risk? How high a risk is this? And it could be actually it's relatively minor. They're pretty compos mentis. Yes, they've got some mobility issues, but they'd be able to get to a place of reasonable safety. Any mitigation that you need to do or that they might need to do, and most of the time it's them that needs to do it. We'll talk about the costs for it in a second. And then when you need to review the PCFRA or this emergency evacuation statement, which is one of the things that's going to come out of the back of this risk assessment. The legislation says at least once a year, but it might be every 3 months. If you've got somebody that is having some kind of palliative care, it might be more often, because one of the things we want to make sure we do is if that resident that's at risk, and we're saying to the fire and rescue service, this flat's going to need some extra help. If that person is no longer in that flat, it's really important that the SIB and the fire risk, the local fire and rescue service is updated quickly to make sure that they don't send resources to a flat that doesn't need it. So the next regulation 7 is basically about the cost for this mitigation. And the crucial thing is the cost can only be borne by the service charge if it benefits 51% or more than 50% of the residents. Otherwise, the resident that requires it needs to pay for that mitigation measure, that evac chair, that handrail, that door opener, or whatever it is. They haven't put in the same safeguards, the same explicit protection for costs for the actual PCFRA. However, the legislation doesn't say at all who should pay for it. All it does say is you need to offer one. There's nothing to say that you can't charge for it. And there's nothing to say that you can't outsource that process. And we certainly have got quite a few of our clients are charging, and it's not cheap to do these PCFRAs. And there's a whole range of, can it be done on the phone? Does it need something face to face? Can it be done on a Zoom call? Whatever. Um, this bit. So this is probably the most important part of the legislation. And it's probably also one of the easiest bits. So it's very unlikely, or it's unlikely that you're going to get much uptake on these PCFRAs. But the whole point of the PCFRA, from your perspective and the Fire and Rescue Services perspective, is to produce this EES, the Emergency Evacuation Statement. And all this is trying to do is agree with the resident what they need to do or what will happen in the event of a fire, and how they're going to be affected by that fire. We also need to produce an even shorter version of this for the Fire and Rescue Service. But this emergency evacuation statement has to also be agreed with the resident. Now, and you have to agree it. Now, you might get to a point where neither of you can get to agreement on it, and that's absolutely fine. But you have to use reasonable endeavors to get to agreement. Then there's a requirement to review by the responsible person. Again, it's an annual requirement at minimum. If for some reason you believe or have any reason to believe something's changed, you might need to do it earlier. So, for instance, if you knew they moved out, or you knew that their condition had deteriorated or somehow got better. So you need other processes and policies so that if anybody does find out this kind of information, that it will trigger this review process. And the resident can also ask you to review the PCFRA at any point, and the EES, by the way. And then one of the last regulations, 10, provision of information to local fire and rescue service. There's three things which the legislation is asking for, or four things actually: the floor number, the flat number. They don't want the resident's name. Basic information, so that's a cut down version of the EES, just what the fire service need to know to make sure that they send the right support to that flat. Pretty much all they really want to know is, where's the resident going to be if they're not going to be in their flat, and how many firefighters do they need to send to go and get that person. And then whether you have this emergency evacuation statement, a full evacuation statement. So you could just say the resident needs 2 people because they're morbidly obese, or 3 people. And you might say you haven't agreed an emergency evacuation statement because the resident didn't want to talk to you about it. There is a whole issue around this provision of information, and there's a guy on LinkedIn who is worth following called Matt Hodges Long, who went and looked at I think it's about 40 fire and rescue services across the UK, and said, well, how do you want this information? Because the legislation only gives them 2 options. Either the fire and rescue service can opt to get this information electronically, and the legislation doesn't specify how they would receive it electronically, or you go and put it in the SIB. So bit of paper in the SIB with a list of the floors and flats and this basic evacuation information. However, most of the fire and rescue services haven't even mentioned PEEPS on their website, and only Norfolk, East Sussex and Surrey are asking for the information digitally. I went onto the Norfolk website last night and went and followed through the process to provide the information digitally. And actually, it didn't ask for any of the information the legislation was asking for. So it didn't ask for the floor and flat numbers or the basic evacuation information. All they wanted to know is, what was the floor with the most number of vulnerable residents, and how many were on that floor? And there's a couple of other very simple questions. So it was a bit odd. Bucks, Dorset, Wiltshire, Essex, Hampshire, Hereford, and Worcester, Norfolk, Northamptonshire, and Berkshire. They are the only ones that have specifically said they want the information in the SIP. Every other fire and rescue service hasn't told us at all, hasn't told anybody at all. And obviously the deadline is next month. So I wouldn't worry too much that you're not prepared because the fire and rescue service haven't bothered to do anything themselves. This is kind of important. And GDPR is horribly complicated. We spend a lot of time and a lot of money researching it, validating things. We've had quite a lot of legal advice on different elements of GDPR. So it's difficult to put it into one slide, but certainly our contractor, the risk assessors and surveyors that use risk-based to go out and do door surveys and door checks, and I'll show you the tools that we've got, often hit a problem with block managers saying, oh, well, I can't give you the leaseholder information, or I can't give you any resident information we have because of GDPR. That's not true. You can share personal information. Personal information includes people's names with contractors if they need it to do their job. The important thing is they need to make sure that they keep it securely or reasonably securely. Obviously, if you've got medical or sensitive information, those contractors do not need to see that, and it 100% should not be shared. Especially when we're storing this and managing this medical and sensitive information, vulnerabilities, potentially ages, evacuation statements, certainly PCFRAs, you need to have an audit trail of how the residents were identified. So how did you find out that these residents were vulnerable? So what was the process? Certainly who accepted and who declined a PCFRA. And you need to keep reoffering them one every year. So if they say they don't want one this year, you've got to give them a bit of a nudge next year and say, do you want one again? Those EES outcomes and all the changes. So the idea is that this stuff is supposed to evolve. And I realize a lot of your residents won't need this information, but the process still has to be there. And then also, who did you share it with? When did you share it? What information did you send, especially to the FRS, along with version control on all of your SIB documents. So as soon as this information updates, you put new data in the SIB. You need to know, one, what that version was, so version 1.1. And yes, I went and updated on the 15th of April. I went physically to the SIB and changed it. Data security around the sensitive information and medical information is also really key. And it's very hard to do any of this kind of stuff in most property and asset management tools because you have to have a log of everybody who's viewed that information. So if you've got a resident with an EES or a PCFRA and a user from one of your systems or your company or a contractor went in and viewed that information, it's absolutely essential that it says John Smith looked at this at this time. And then John Smith changed this, and this is the thing that he changed. And then finally, Data Use and Access Act. Careful not to misinterpret this, but basically, if there was an emergency, and they were trying to evacuate the whole building, and you had a whole load of information from residents about their vulnerabilities and disabilities, and they had said, no, you can't share that with the fire and rescue service. I probably didn't make that as a point. I'll make it again in a second. But if the resident didn't give you permission to share that information, in the event of an emergency, when that building was actually on fire, that point, the Data Use and Access Act allows you to provide that information to the fire and rescue services. So let me just cover that other point. When you produce this EES or the PCFRA and ultimately this EES with the residents, you have to get permission to make sure that you can share that with the fire and rescue services. If they withhold it, fine, you can keep it and maintain it and talk to them about it, but you can't give that information over to the fire and rescue service. This final point, the beep, not just that they're not rented or any other residents, and any other special evacuation arrangements for that building. Should just be information. You should just build it into all your SIBs anyway, but just make sure those points are checked off and do that annual review. Most disability legislation is focused on physical disabilities, but it's worth looking at this a little bit more holistically. This has to be a person-centered process, the whole point of PCFRA. And so to do that, we need to make sure we also comply with secondary legislation around this stuff. Words in letters, it's very easy to write relatively complicated letters with lots of acronyms in it. And yes, we need to kind of comply with the legislation for PCFRAs and EESs and PEEPS, but probably in communication with them, they're not terms that we need to use. So keeping that simple and friendly. Digital self-service, some people with disabilities can't use it, but there are probably people that are there to help them that can use it. And that's really helpful because it gets things done. You might have to get involved, pick up the phone, talk somebody through it, talk to family, and potentially especially with the PCFRAs, it might need face-to-face stuff. And yes, there's a cost associated to that. For these kind of proxy carers, the specific requirements in the legislation for people with powers of attorney and parental responsibilities and court-appointed guardians, but we've also got to look at people that don't have those, don't have that in place. So having somebody else that you can contact about this stuff for vulnerable residents is also key. I'll show you some of the stuff that we're doing, which basically allows family members to complete things on behalf of vulnerable people or even just residents. If you're using digital tech, self-service forms, this is when disability stuff becomes really important. Screen readers, making sure there's contrast between images, buttons that are clickable, that kind of thing, audio captions. It's not hugely difficult, but it does considerably add to the process. And you just need to check this stuff out. There's loads of tools out there on the web to make sure your processes, your forms, your websites comply. So before I kind of show you how I think this process can work, this I feel is a bit of a summary of what we've talked about. To make this efficient, rather than dealing with those 4 bits of legislation piecemeal and all of the requirements in those 4 bits of legislation piecemeal, you kind of need to build a system, and whether that's an electronic system or not and how it works is kind of up to you. But if we can get all of this stuff into one process, then life becomes a lot easier. We need something that's going to get live building and fire safety information. So always that up-to-date information. And we need to make that available to residents. So that's Building Safety Act and Fire Safety Order. We need to identify and know who the residents are, an ongoing continuous process, including tenants. And we need to be able to make sure that we can nudge them at least every 12 months. And we need to give them a tool so that they can nudge us back and say, I want this, or I want to update this information. We need that disability and accessibility requirements dealt with. We know we've got this touch point every year, certainly for the blocks requiring PEEPS, for this flat entrance door check. And this is something where you are face to face with a resident most of the time, unless you've got some kind of a concierge that's letting you into some of the doors. But this is the point at which that information, which we can't scrape automatically, where we've emailed people and sent them WhatsApps and sent them letters and they've still not responded, that's the chance to kind of gather that missing data about residents. And if we've got to organise that flat entrance door check, we just need to make sure that, well, if we're making that contact point to say, look, we're going to come next Thursday to do this flat entrance door check. By the way, we don't know who else lives there. We don't know whether any of you have got vulnerabilities. By the way, do you know everything that you need to know about fire safety and the importance of fire doors and not wedging them open? The fewer touch points we can have with these residents, and we know that most of them are agnostic about fire safety, the fewer touch points, the more effective. If you go and talk to them 10 times a year about fire safety, they're just going to ignore everything about fire safety. If you can make that process really smooth and easy for them to work with, then you'll get a really high response rate. And the response rates we're seeing are kind of between the 60 and 70% on a first pass. Then you need to manage all the work that's coming out of these flat entrance doors, and you need to chase leaseholders to get that work done. Most of the time, leaseholders, you need a tool that's managing these PCFRAs and these EESs that will automatically update your SIB tools. And you need security and auditing around all of that stuff. So I will now show you how we do it. Hopefully everybody can see that screen. Zoom is trying to make my life difficult. Okay. For those of you who haven't seen Risk-Based, this is our app. It's pretty straightforward, easy to use, works on a phone, it works on a tablet, it works in a web browser, just like this. I'm in our Engage portal, and our Engage portal is pretty much all about managing information that goes to residents. And I've gone into a flat. This is all demo data. It is not live, so don't worry about any security stuff. And so I've gone into a block of flats, and I've got 10 flats in Nelson Mandela House. And you can see at a glance, everything's looking pretty tidy. I've got on most of these flats here, I've got 2 residents, 2 owners, and those residents and owners are the same people. So John Smith owns it and lives there. Sarah also owns it and lives there. And here I've got 2 people that own a flat, but it's rented out. And I've got 2 residents that live there with 2 children as well. And I can delete people when they move out or archive them. I say they've moved out. And then they appear in an archive list. And if I've done that by mistake or they move back, I can unarchive them and bring them back into the flat. So just some really simple stuff around who these residents are, what their name is, what their role is. If they've completed forms or information on behalf of somebody else, so they might not live there or own it, but they might be filling information out on behalf of their mother or father who lives there, along with some contact information. And then we've got a messaging tab, which I'll show you later. But I've also got 2 other things which are pretty obvious on this page. I've got some problems here where, and it's saying resident issues and a survey is required. I've got an owner, but the flat is unoccupied. So I don't know who lives there. And I've also got somebody right at the top here who requires evacuation support. So if let's go and look at flat 7, who's got this resident issue. So in here, I can see that Daniel owns the flat, so he's the leaseholder. We try and use these simpler terms, owner and rather than leaseholder, because it means when we start to show this stuff to front end to residents, it's simpler terminology. So I can see that he confirmed that this morning, and it expires in a year's time. So that aligns with all the legislative requirements to go back and check in with people in a year. But what I don't know is who lives in the flat. So I just know that they own it. So we've got resident information required. and a contact survey. And our contact survey is basically a message that goes to that flat to say who lives here, and can you make contact with us? So we've got some past messages here. This is me kind of testing earlier on, but I can go and send a message to that flat. And in this case, it's a survey request letter because I don't know who lives there. I've got no contact information. I can send that contact survey request letter. It will send a physical letter out to that flat. So that's going to post something. I could send an email to the owner and say, can you please tell us who lives in your flat? And it'll do exactly the same thing, but just in an email version. That email will give them a link. So that customer, that owner will get a link that says, can you tell us who lives in the flat? This is all customizable. And I say, who are you? Well, I'm Daniel. Yeah, I'm Daniel. Or maybe I'm not. Do you own the flat? Yeah, I own it. Or maybe I've sold it. Fine. Do you live there? Yeah, actually, yeah, and I do live there. Or no, I don't live there. Fine. So we'll say he doesn't live there. Okay. Does anybody else own it with you? No, nobody does. Sorry, if we'll talk about integration later. If this is already in Dwellent or Cube or whatever, we pull this and it becomes unedit, non-editable. But if we're working from a blank slate, then I'm just trying to show you the full power of the system. And then it says, well, can you tell us who lives here? Yeah, there are residents. Are they under 16? If they're under 16, we don't ask for their name. So I'd stick a phone number in. If we've got phone numbers, we can do things like text message and WhatsApps. Do they need help with evacuation? So this is the start of that vulnerability questions. Well, I don't actually know, so I'm not going to answer that. And then are there any other residents? If there are other residents, I can go through and add them, or no, there's nobody else. And also, if I completed that, it's done. And this page, flat 7, whoops, flat 7 will update, and I've got Steve McStevenson. But I also sent a letter to the flat. I know we just looked at the link from the email. Let me show you what the letter looks like. So again, customizable. And actually in our later versions, these letters look a lot nicer, but they get a physical letter with a QR code that they can scan or like a short URL, and then they enter a 12-digit code and it takes them to exactly the same form. Or to a very similar form. There's some data protection issues around if we're emailing people or writing to people that we don't know. So the next thing that we spotted was that this evacuation support for flat 1. So John Smith here has got support needs. And if I click on him, we can see here, fine. We know he's got support needs. We don't know what they are. I can see that Brent, this is the demo user that I'm logged in as, is pretty nosy. And yesterday went in 4 times and looked at the information, his personal information, and edited it. And if I want to go in and view it, that will trigger another line in that audit trail. But I'm viewing now his PEEP effectively, or the PEEP process. So why does he need help? Well, he needs help with stairs. So these are the tick boxes that we ask residents when they fill out the form. And then we've got an agreed evacuation statement. So that's just a sample evacuation statement. Has the resident agreed it? Yeah, they agreed it on this date. And then we've got this summary version, which is used for the fire and rescue service. And if they'd agreed to share it, that would then also update the SIV document or prompt you to provide that information electronically. We can also see that Steve had a PCFRA. It was offered on the 1st of Feb, accepted on the 3rd of Feb, and then it was uploaded on the 7th. So, and you can upload, download, you can offer a new one. And again, it will remind you to share, so to update that information 365 days later. So as soon as I go in there, I've viewed his information. You'll see now somebody, this Brent guy, has viewed personal information again. So there's a full kind of audit trail there. This is just that resident management piece. Within this process, I can obviously search for, so I can search for Steve. It'll give me all the Steves. I can also, instead of going into flats individually, I can grab all of them or just grab certain ones and go and send some messages. So I can send some standard messages or requests. I can say, I only send it to owners, fine. And it'll tell me exactly who we've got as owners, or if we've got a concept of primary contacts. So if you have multiple residents, the system will go, oh, we've got one that's a primary contact, I'll email them. Otherwise, I'm going to email everybody. So a whole load of bulk management tools. And also a lot of this stuff can be automated based on your policies. But one of the next things we've got to do is manage flat entrance door checks. So we've got these scheduled visits. I've got an old one here, which was cancelled. I've got one for next Monday, which I can view. And this is often done by whoever's doing those flat entrance door checks. But ultimately, they go in, set the times that they're going to be available. They can have some inspectors, and it can put nice pictures of people on there. It kind of makes it a little bit personal. And then it will automatically message people, all right, fine, this was scheduled today or yesterday for a week's time. So it hasn't really got much chance to do things. But generally, you'd schedule something for a month's time. It'll then send out a first email, potentially letter. We don't want to use letters because they're so expensive now. We send out a basic request with an email in it. And the emails look nice, by the way. I'll show you what they look like. It's not just a whole load of text. And then we send them a reminder saying, you didn't click on that email or respond to our letter asking whether you're going to be available on the 5th of April. And then we'll also chase them. We'll remind them if they have responded and go, you said you'd be available tomorrow between 2 and 4 p.m. Just a little reminder. And then they can go in and say, actually, I won't be available, or maybe they're going to be available at a different time. And it just breaks down, says who it's going to send letters to. If for some reason I'm not going to do that check anymore, I can cancel it, and it'll then send them another email to go, we've cancelled everything, the check's not happening, I'm sorry. So some really nice workflow around that. We create a new check. So if I scheduled a new flat entrance door survey and I wanted to do it in 2 weeks' time, I can add my test user and someone else in. Oops, I need to set the date. So I've set the date for a few weeks' time, and I can literally specify the times that the surveyor or the inspector is going to go around. I can say, actually, they're going to be there 2 days in a row. So they'll be there on the 26th. And I can kind of copy and paste the days they're doing the same schedules, or maybe they're doing different schedules. Obviously, we can go earlier and later in the days as well. You can put Saturdays in there. And then it'll automatically send out these messages for me. Sorry, hold on, to publish that. And then once it's published those emails and those letters will be queued for sending. Worth also pointing out, generally what happens, you have a first pass and you give people really broad availability. Say, look, these are when our inspectors are going to be here. Will you be around, do you think? It's not an appointment setting service, it's just a kind of an awareness thing. once you've done your first pass of those door checks, maybe the next month or a quarter later, when you're doing other regular checks under the Fire Safety England regs, maybe you're doing the communal door, so you're going to go back every quarter and try and do some flat entrance door checks. The flats that you couldn't get into, you're going to then go and chase again. And instead of giving them hours, you might give them 15-minute slots. And we can change the system so that they can choose a time slot rather than just giving broad availability. Let me show you what that looks like. So I've sent that out. So if I go into one of these flats, what I should see in the messages is this, the schedule visit request email. So because we had this person's email on file, they didn't get a letter. If we didn't have the email, then they would get a letter. So we're explaining what they're doing, why they're doing a door check, why the door check's important. Sorry, hold on. And then they click on that link, and this is what the link will do, what it will show them. And so it'll just say, okay, Brent and Byron are both going to go out. This is your flat one. What's the flat entrance door check for? So this is all just trying to tick off those fire safety order, Fire Safety England requirements, as well as the new PEEPS legislation. Are you going to be around? Yeah, I should be around here and here. Or actually, no, not around at all. And if they say they're around, they can come back to this link as well and update this. Brilliant. Thanks very much for your help. And off you go. So that's all very well. We've managed to get all the resident information into our flats. But what we can also now do is get that information to our surveyors. I just want to show you why this is an integrated process. When the surveyor goes out to site and does a door survey, what they will now see when they go and do the flat entrance door checks is a list of the residents that are available and when they're available. So once they've completed those surveys, they can see the availability. So if they'd specified several days, several time slots, those inspectors can go and jump on those people that they know are available. Which just means that they go through and can obviously get into doors more quickly with less revisits. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm not going to give any more of a demo, and I'm getting nudged to stop. The system itself can also I cancel the sharing. The system itself will also notify leaseholders to say we did your flat entrance door check, and we found some issues. Or we did the flat entrance door check and we didn't find any issues. It'll also write to the resident, go, by the way, the door didn't shut properly. We're going to come and adjust your closer. And it can also automate getting the leaseholder to agree to works. So either message the leaseholder, you need to adjust the door closer, this is how you do it, it's an Allen key, or you need to install a new one, make sure you buy one that's compatible to this standard, send us a picture and a copy of an invoice, or send us a video, literally a video of the door now closing effectively, and we'll complete this, or here's 2 contractors that will quote for you, and they can tick a button and the contractors will then go and quote. And then as that work gets completed, either by them or by a contractor, it updates your task manager and ultimately your door survey, fire risk assessment, the Engage portal that we have as well that will share all of this information with residents, and just keeps it one tidy place of, call it the golden thread, but all of your building and fire compliance information. I hope that's helpful. I'm looking for a chat window. And I will try and go through some of these.
Adam, but we've got a couple of questions that are related. The first one from Emma Williams, and the second one I'll read straight after, and you can answer together as quickly as possible. We have been told by our fire service that we need to hold information such as this in the fire document folder at the property. They prefer a fire document folder that can be picked up and taken out of the property rather than a locked firebox. However, fire document folders, we are concerned, can be accessed by other residents. Where do we stand on this if the fire brigade ask for a folder rather than a locked box? And
Uh,
follow-up question, what information actually has to be shared with the fire and rescue service, and how should we share it exactly? If the building is an HRB, it has a SIB. If it's a lower rise, it doesn't have a SIB.
okay. But really fair point from Emma. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The um, the legislation is clear. This stuff has to be secure, and a SIB by its name, and this is the old girder boxes were called PIBs, premises information boxes. In the Fire Safety England regulations, they're called secure information boxes, SIBs. So yes, they have to be secure. No, the fire service can't have it in a folder that they can just walk in and take out. It can be in a folder, but it has to be in a folder in the SIB, or they have it electronically. So 100% legislation is very clear on that. Tell the fire and rescue service to do one. And then the other question, what if you don't have a SIB because it's an 11-meter property with a simultaneous evacuation strategy? So this is a nuance in the legislation. The RPEEPS legislation applies to 18-meter or seven-story blocks. It also applies to 11-meter blocks if there's a simultaneous evacuation strategy. And it says, although you wouldn't normally have a SIB in an 11-meter building, if you have a vulnerable resident that has a PEEP or an EES, then you will have to install a SIB and comply with the Fire Safety England regulations purely for this one resident. Does that make sense?
That's good. Thank you, Adam. Archie, any questions from you?
Yes. Then we've got a question from Hayley Waters, which reads, if the resident does not give consent to share their data with the fire service, but then there is a fire, was there not provision to share on this instance with a view to their ultimate life safety? Some individuals may be vulnerable and combative as a feature of their vulnerability. How has this all fallen on block managers? Does an absent landlord not have a greater duty of care to their tenant?
I completely agree with all of that. Yeah, so this was that Data Use and Access Act, which basically says if the resident hasn't given permission to share that information with the fire and rescue service, in an event of an emergency, you can share it if it's going to save lives, basically. And I completely agree. How has this fallen on block managers? It's crazy because the whole Hackett process, well, actually not the Hackett process, but the Grenfell inquiry was just so focused on social housing. There's another question on recoverable costs. You're absolutely right. This stuff is not a service charge. If you're doing anything first of all, you're not responsible for doing anything inside the flat. PEEPS, PCFRAs, and any mitigation coming out of them is not a service charge item, unless it's a mitigation measure that benefits the majority of residents. I hope that's clear. If you want some more clarification, ask. There's another question. When these checks are being booked in, is this something we can share with a contractor? Yes, 100%. Contractors get access to this. And when you set them up, you can prevent them from looking at personal information. So one tick box. Most of the time, that bit of getting contractors to go there and schedule those visits, most people just let the contractors go and manage that themselves, because it tends to be them adding inspectors and changing things, and then setting the exact day that they go. But otherwise, you can do it, and you're adding the contractor and basically assigning them to that job. Annual door checks. There's something about if you have a concierge, presume the management of things like an annual door check can be done face to face. I think, but it's by far the best way of doing it. Getting concierge to do these door checks is the best way. They do not require third parties. The more you can do this in-house, the better. If you've got a concierge doing it, just use Riskspace. It really does tie that process together, and it takes seconds to do these checks. Any other questions that stand out?
Adam, Joshua asks, he says, you mentioned it can pull data from Dwellant. Does any of the updated information feed backwards?
Sorry, I forgot to show this on the demo. Yes. Pretty much any system with an open API we can integrate with. There was another slide that I was going to go through, which I forgot to do. We can pull information from and push information from Dwellant, Fixedflow. Well, actually, if you've got Fixedflow, please go and badger them because they're really hard work for us to deal with. Cube, we're a business partner of Cube's as well. And we're really big on keeping information consistent. So lots of software companies go, oh, use us because you can manage everything in one place and we do everything. At Riskbase, we know that most of the compliance activity, fire and safety activity happens with contractors. So it's contractors that tend to use Riskbase, and we push data back into other systems. So Riskbase is a silent system a lot of the time, probably apart from some of this kind of PEEP and PCFRA process. But if we pull information from a system, we will always go back and update it. And we can also set information. So if you've got leaseholder information, for instance, in another system, we will not go and change that. That gets locked so that we're not, people aren't accidentally messing with other systems. So plenty of configuration available.
Adam, one more, but I think before Vicky might cut us off, we'll see how many we can get away with. Sam Blapworth would like this one answered live. We attempted to answer it. Separately. How can the PCFRA be a service charge cost which benefits only that resident if you're saying that mitigation measures must benefit 51%? But the PCFRA, is that a service charge cost? Just to be clear.
No, it's not. No, it's not. PCFRA is definitely not a service charge cost. And the legislation they haven't dealt with it. Everybody I know is charging the relevant resident for the PCFRA.
Okay, we need to backtrack on some of our answers, suggesting it may well be a service charge cost. But I think we should all follow that up with a leasehold solicitor to try and get a concrete answer. But thank you, Adam.
Cool. So somebody else, our golden thread info is electronic on software called monday.com, blah, blah, blah. We can integrate with Monday. We use Monday ourselves here. I would just be careful about how it stores information. It's pretty clunky and tends to be quite document focused. Yeah. Right.
I don't want to
questions?
cut you off, but there are still a lot of questions to get through. So what I would suggest, if I can forward them to you, and then anyone who's left their contact information, Adam and the team will be able to get back to you directly.
Yeah.
There are quite a few questions that have been left anonymously as well. So if it's something that you would like to speak to Adam and the team about, please do get in touch with them. And then I'm sure they will be able to help you.
Cool. You can email Archie. He's really good at answering emails.
Yeah.
We will go through all of the questions and try and put a little FAQ together. If anybody wants to see the system, see how it kind of ties in with other resident engagement portals, the whole process end to end, including doing the door surveys, give us a shout. Go on the website, book a demo. If you've got technical questions around the legislation, genuinely email archie.donald@riskbase.uk, and because he is a massive geek and he knows everything.
All right, thank you very much, Adam. That was brilliant. Thank you to Jonathan and Archie as well for fielding a lot of those questions in the Q&A. There was a huge amount of questions come through today, which was lovely to see all that interaction with everyone. Yeah, thank you again. Thank you to everyone that joined us. Hopefully I will see a lot of you at Leasehold London next week, where Adam will also be. So if anyone wants to speak to him directly, can also see him there in person. Otherwise, I will see you on the next one, and I hope you all have a brilliant day.
Great stuff. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you,
Thanks, Adam.
Vicky.
Bye, everyone.